So this is a real analysis course, so let's try to address what is the Borel sigma algebra on R. What are the Borel measurable subsets of R? We've spent a lot of time in this course thinking about subsets of R. So of the ones we've discussed in the past, which ones are Borel measurable and which ones are not? It turns out that probably all of the ones we've discussed are Borel measurable. It's actually hard to think of something that is not Borel measurable. And as mentioned before, sigma algebra generation is really weird. So we're not going to come up with a nice constructive description for what this is. At least I don't know if that there is one. I'm not sure. But I think there is not one. Let's just talk about things that we think are in here. Or let's talk about things that we are certain are in here. And also let's look at different ways of describing how to generate this. So we'll let T here be the collection of open subsets of R. Then remember the definition is this is the sigma algebra on R generated by this collection. So what kind of sets are Borel? Well, definitely the open sets, so like open intervals, those would be Borel. But also this is supposed to be closed inter complements, so are closed sets. So closed intervals, for example, or unions of open and closed intervals, right? This is supposed to be closed inter unions, even countable unions and countable intersections. A half open interval would also be in there, since you could, if you have an interval that's shaped like this, not including one endpoint but including the other, you could always write it as sort of the union of an open interval and a closed one. Right, so all kinds of intervals, even half-open ones, are definitely in there. So yeah, like I'm saying, it's hard to come up with a subset of R that's not a Borel set. So one way we can try to simplify our description of the Borel sigma algebra is to try to come up with a smaller generating set. So do we really need to put all open sets here, or can we put something smaller? So what does it take to generate the Borel sigma algebra? Every open subset of R, so every, let's call it G, in there, every open subset of R is a countable union of open intervals. Now, I dug back into, so I went back to some of our textbooks for 118A and B, and I was digging through looking for this kind of result to see if I can connect it back to something we've done before. But I think we never actually proved this. The closest idea I could find is this old exercise from chapter 1 of Abbott, which I think I assigned in my 118A, where you argue that it's not possible to have an uncountable collection of disjoint open intervals in the real line. So that tells you at least that if you can show that an open set is a union of disjoint open intervals, then you will be guaranteed that there can be at most countably many of them. So that's not a very hard exercise, but it does take some effort to prove that every open set is at least a union of disjoint open intervals. If you're familiar with the idea of connected components in topology, then that might be an accessible way to prove that. But otherwise, if you're interested in verifying this fact, since I couldn't find it in previous things, and since it's too much of a diversion for us to just go and start doing it now, I'm going to put a link to a very nice, very short solution I found on Stack Exchange for how to prove this fact without relying on lots of other topology facts. So just like a pure direct proof. So I'll put the link in the description to this video. I always wanted to say that. The link will be in the description. Now, let I equal, so this is supposed to be a script I, the set of open intervals. So let I be that. Then, this idea that every open set is a countable union of open intervals, that tells you that the collection of open sets, so the topology on R, the collection of open sets, is in the sigma algebra on R that is generated by the collection of open intervals. It's a collection of open sets. So this sigma algebra is going to contain at least the countable unions of the open intervals. So it contains at least the topology. So since this is a sigma algebra that contains the topology on R, we can conclude that it contains the smallest sigma algebra that contains the topology, also known as the Borel sigma algebra. So we have this. And we also have this inclusion because open intervals are at least in there, right? So they are in the sigma algebra generated by that. Right? So if this set is in a subset of that, then the sigma algebra it generates is going to be a subset of this, which is a sigma algebra. Or let me put it another way. This is a sigma algebra that contains script I, and so it contains the smallest one, namely this. So with all that talking, what we've got is that the Borel sigma algebra on R can be described as a sigma algebra generated by a much smaller class of sets than all the open sets. You can take only the open intervals. That would be enough to generate it. And if you prefer, you can also go larger, right? You can be like, well, it's the sigma algebra generated by open and closed sets. So up to you what you want to do with your generating set. And finally, I'm going to direct you to, let me look here, lemma 1 to 11. Where you can find some other nice generating sets for the Borel sigma algebra on R. Okay, so I'm going to say that's a wrap for section 1.2 in the textbook. And there's some other stuff at the end of section 1.2 about other structures of sort of measurable like sets that you can put on a set X. They're called things like rings and semi-rings, rather than just algebra of sets or sigma rings. But I feel like that'll be information overload if we include all of those things, especially considering that through the hard work of people who came before us, we already know what are the main important structures to focus on, and that's not even algebras of sets. The main one to focus on is sigma algebras. So we've introduced both of these ideas, algebra of sets and sigma algebra, so that we can keep track sort of what difficulties are brought about specifically from the countable unions idea, closure under countable unions versus finite. So that's a nice thing to track, but I don't want to necessarily keep track of everything that we could keep track of with all the different types of algebra-like things. So there are later theorems that mention these things that I'm not mentioning, like rings of sets. But I'm gonna see if if it becomes important, then I'll go back and we'll cover it and I'll include it in the lecture. But I'm gonna try to skip those parts for now.